Welcome to Miss Scarlett. Subscribe and don't miss out on Patreon. Have fun! Camden arrived at the beach at the crack of dawn, alone with his thoughts and his beloved Canon DSLR. The morning air was crisp, carrying the aroma of wet sand and a hint of salty mist. With each step, he felt the soft sand caress his bare feet, his camera gear swinging gently by his side. The early riser's pale blue eyes scanned the horizon, witnessing the breathtaking dance between the sun and the sea. As the first rays of sunlight bathed the coast, a flock of seagulls swooped in unison, as if guided by an invisible maestro. Inspired by the graceful movements, Camden's heart raced. He spotted a group of morning joggers, their silhouettes graceful against the rising sun. The fluidity of the skirts against the backdrop of the ocean stirred something within him. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to explore here.
"Hey, Rob,"
Camden called out to his assistant.
"Can you set up a meeting with the agency? I've got an idea for our next shoot."
Rob nodded, already reaching for his phone.
"Sure thing, boss. What's the concept?"
Camden hesitated for a moment.
"It's different. We're going to use skirts, but on male models."
Rob's eyebrows shot up, but he didn't comment.
"All right, I'll make the call."
The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Camden threw himself into the preparations, selecting fabrics, coordinating with stylists, and scouting locations. He couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this excited about a shoot. On the day of the photo shoot, the beach was alive with activity. Crew members bustled about, setting up equipment and adjusting lighting. Camden surveyed the scene, a sense of anticipation building in his chest. The first model stepped out, wearing a flowing white skirt that billowed in the breeze. Camden's breath caught in his throat. It was exactly as he'd envisioned.
"Perfect,"
he murmured, raising his camera.
"Now, walk towards the water. Let the fabric move with you."
As the day progressed, Camden found himself completely absorbed in the shoot. Each click of the shutter felt like a revelation, capturing something raw and beautiful. During a break, Rob approached Camden, a thoughtful expression on his face.
"This is really something, boss. I've never seen you so invested in a shoot before."
Camden nodded, his eyes still on the horizon.
"There's just something about it, you know? The way the fabric moves, how it changes the silhouette. It's freeing,"
Rob supplied. Camden turned to look at his assistant, surprised.
"Yeah, exactly."
As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow across the beach, Camden felt a sudden urge. He turned to Rob.
"I want to try it."
Rob blinked.
"Try what?" "The skirt. I want to be in a shot."
There was a moment of silence before Rob shrugged.
"Why not? It's your shoot."
Heart pounding, Camden made his way to the wardrobe tent. He selected a simple black skirt, running his hands over the soft fabric. With a deep breath, he changed. Stepping out onto the sand, Camden felt exposed, vulnerable. But as the sea breeze caught the skirt, making it dance around his legs, something shifted. He felt right. Rob, ever the professional, didn't bat an eye. He simply picked up Camden's camera and said,
"Ready when you are, boss."
Camden moved towards the water, letting the skirt flow around him. He closed his eyes, feeling the wind, the spray of the ocean, the fabric against his skin. When he opened them again, he saw Rob lowering the camera, a look of awe on his face.
"These are incredible,"
Rob said,
showing Camden the display. Camden stared at the images, barely recognizing himself. The person in the photos looked free, confident, beautiful. It was like seeing himself for the first time. That night, Camden couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, his mind racing. The image of himself in the skirt kept appearing every time he closed his eyes. It wasn't just about the clothing, he realized. It was about who he saw in those photos. As dawn broke, Camden sat up in bed, a sense of clarity washing over him. The person in those photos wasn't Camden. It was Mary. And it was time for Mary to step into the light. The next few weeks were a blur of appointments, conversations, and decisions. Mary began hormone therapy, started growing out her hair, and slowly began to transition her wardrobe. She confided in Rob, who proved to be an unwavering source of support. "I always knew there was something special about you," Rob said one day, as they were reviewing photos from the beach shoot. "I just didn't realize how special." Mary smiled, touched by his words. "Thank you, Rob. I don't know what I'd do without you." As Mary's body began to change, so did her photography. Her work took on a new depth, a raw honesty that hadn't been there before. She found herself drawn to subjects that challenged traditional gender norms, using her art to explore and celebrate diversity. 6 months into her transition, Mary decided it was time to come out publicly. She chose to do it through her art, organizing a gallery showing of her recent work, including the photos from the beach shoot that had started it all. The night of the opening, Mary stood in front of her mirror, adjusting the emerald green dress she had chosen for the occasion. Her brown hair, now shoulder length, framed her face softly. She barely recognized the person staring back at her, yet she had never felt more like herself. "You ready?" Rob called from the other room. Mary took a deep breath. "As I'll ever be." The gallery was packed when they arrived. Mary's heart raced as she made her way through the crowd, greeting friends, colleagues, and art critics. The air buzzed with excitement and curiosity about the new direction her work had taken. As she approached the centerpiece of the exhibition, the photo of herself on the beach, Mary felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to find Amanda, a fellow photographer and longtime friend. "Camden?" Amanda asked, her eyes wide with surprise and confusion. Mary smiled gently. "It's Mary now, actually." Amanda was silent for a moment, her gaze moving between Mary and the photograph. Then, slowly, a smile spread across her face. "Mary," she repeated, as if testing the name. "It suits you." Relief washed over Mary. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. As the night progressed, Mary found herself surrounded by support and acceptance. Colleagues praised her bravery, friends offered hugs and words of encouragement, and even the critics seemed impressed by the authenticity of her new work. Towards the end of the evening, Mary found a quiet moment alone in front of the beach photograph. She stared at the image of her past self, marveling at how far she'd come. "Quite a journey, huh?" Rob's voice came from behind her. Mary turned, smiling at her faithful assistant and friend. "It really has been." Rob gestured to the crowd mingling in the gallery. "So, what's next? Now that the world knows Mary, where do you go from here?" Mary considered the question, her eyes drifting back to the photograph. "I think I want to help others find themselves the way I did, through art, through representation. There are so many stories out there waiting to be told."
Rob nodded approvingly. Sounds like a plan. Count me in. As they stood there, contemplating the future, Mary felt a sense of peace settle over her. The journey hadn't been easy, and she knew there would be more challenges ahead, but for the first time in her life, she was truly herself, and that made everything worth it. In the months that followed, Mary's career soared to new heights. Her unique perspective and powerful storytelling through photography resonated with people around the world. She became known not just for her artistic talent, but for her advocacy and representation of diverse identities. One sunny afternoon, as Mary was setting up for a new shoot in her studio, a young, aspiring photographer named Chris knocked on her door. He looked nervous, clutching his portfolio tightly. "Come in," Mary called out warmly. "You must be Chris. Rob mentioned you'd be stopping by." Chris nodded, his eyes wide as he took in the studio. "Thank you for seeing me, Ms. Mary. Your work has been a huge inspiration to me." Mary smiled, gesturing for Chris to take a seat. "I'm glad to hear that. Why don't you show me what you've got?" As Chris began to flip through his portfolio, Mary could sense his nervousness. There was something familiar about it, something that went beyond the usual jitters of a young artist showing their work. "These are really good, Chris," Mary said encouragingly. "You have a great eye for composition." Chris smiled shyly. "Thank you. I've been following your career for a while now, especially since you came out." Mary nodded, understanding. "And how did that make you feel?" Chris was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing the edge of a photograph. "It made me feel seen, like maybe I wasn't alone in feeling different." Mary leaned forward, her voice gentle. "Chris, is there something you want to talk about?" Chris took a deep breath, his eyes meeting Mary's. I think I might be trans too, but I'm scared. I don't know how to be who I am and still pursue my dreams." Mary felt a surge of empathy. She remembered all too well the fear and uncertainty of those early days. "Chris, let me tell you something. Being true to yourself doesn't mean giving up your dreams. In fact, it often means you can pursue them more fully, more authentically." She stood up and walked over to a wall covered in photographs. "See these? Some of my best work came after I transitioned, because I was finally able to see the world, and myself clearly." Chris joined her at the wall, his eyes scanning the images. "How did you find the courage?" Mary smiled softly. "One day at a time, one photo at a time. It's not always easy, but it's worth it, and you don't have to do it alone." She turned to face Chris. "If you want, I could mentor you, not just in photography, but in navigating this journey. What do you say?" Chris's eyes lit up. "Really? You'd do that?" Mary nodded. "Of course. We've got to stick together, right?" As Chris left the studio that day, with plans to return for their first official mentoring session, Mary felt a warmth in her chest. She thought back to that day on the beach, when a simple skirt had set her on this path. How far she'd come since then, and how many more journeys lay ahead. That evening, as Mary was packing up her equipment, Rob poked his head into the studio. "Hey, how'd it go with Chris?" Mary smiled, a hint of excitement in her eyes. "Really well. I think we're going to be working together for a while." Rob raised an eyebrow. "Oh, taking on an apprentice?" "Something like that," Mary replied. "You know, Rob, I've been thinking. Maybe it's time we expanded the business a bit. Start a program for young photographers, especially those from marginalized communities. Rob grinned. Always thinking big, aren't you? But I like it. What did you have in mind? As they locked up the studio and headed out into the evening, Mary shared her vision. A photography program that would not only teach technical skills, but also empower young artists to tell their own stories, to challenge norms, and to find their authentic voices. It won't be easy, Rob cautioned. We'll need funding, space, equipment. Mary nodded, undeterred. I know, but think of the impact we could have. Think of all the Chrissies out there, all the young Marys, just waiting for a chance to show the world who they really are. Rob was quiet for a moment. Then he chuckled. You know, when I signed on as your assistant all those years ago, I never imagined we'd end up here. But I wouldn't have it any other way. Mary smiled, linking her arm through Rob's as they walked. Neither would I, Rob. Neither would I. As they made their way home, the setting sun painted the sky in vibrant hues. Mary couldn't help but raise her camera, capturing the moment. In that simple act, she felt the echoes of that day on the beach, the day she first glimpsed her true self through the lens. She lowered the camera, a sense of contentment washing over her. The journey hadn't always been easy, but it had led her here, to a place of authenticity, purpose, and the opportunity to help others find their way. As the first stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Mary felt a renewed sense of excitement for the future. There were still so many stories to tell, so many lives to touch, and she was ready for every moment of it. The next morning, Mary woke up early, her mind already buzzing with ideas for the mentorship program. She slipped on a comfortable blue dress and made her way to the kitchen to start her day with a cup of coffee. As she sipped the warm brew, she opened her laptop and began to outline her plans. She wanted to create a safe, inclusive space where young photographers could explore their art and their identities without fear or judgment. A notification popped up on her screen, an email from a major art magazine requesting an interview about her recent work and her journey. Mary smiled, remembering a time when such recognition seemed impossible. She quickly typed out a response, agreeing to the interview. Just as she was about to close her laptop, another email caught her eye. It was from Chris, thanking her for yesterday's meeting and expressing excitement about their upcoming mentorship sessions. Attached was a new photograph he'd taken, inspired by their conversation. Mary opened the attachment and gasped softly. The image was beautiful. A self-portrait of Chris, half in shadow, half in light, reaching towards the camera. It was raw, honest, and full of potential. She immediately replied, praising Chris's work and suggesting they use this photo as a starting point for their first session. As she hit send, Mary felt a surge of pride and purpose. This was why she was doing all of this, to help others find their light, just as she had found hers. The rest of the day flew by in a whirlwind of activity. Mary had a photo shoot scheduled with a rising musician who was breaking gender norms in the industry. As she set up her equipment in the studio, she couldn't help but reflect on how much her work had evolved. The musician arrived, dressed in an eclectic mix of traditionally masculine and feminine clothing. Mary greeted them warmly, immediately putting them at ease with her open and accepting demeanor. As the shoot progressed, Mary found herself in her element. She directed the musician with confidence, capturing images that showcased not just their appearance, but their essence. Each click of the shutter felt like a celebration of individuality and self-expression. During a break, the musician approached Mary. You know, I was nervous about this shoot, they admitted. I've had bad experiences with photographers who didn't understand or respect my identity, but with you, I feel seen. Mary's heart swelled at these words. That's the greatest compliment you could give me, she replied sincerely. Being seen, truly seen, is so important. It's what my work is all about. As the day wound down and the musician left, Mary began to review the photos. Each image seemed to pulse with life and authenticity. She knew these photos would not only boost the musician's career, but also provide representation for others who might be struggling with their identity. Just as she was wrapping up, Rob burst into the studio, his face alight with excitement. Mary, you're not going to believe this! Mary looked up, startled. What is it, Rob? Remember that grant we applied for? The one for community art programs? Rob was practically bouncing on his feet. We got it! Full funding for the mentorship program! Mary's jaw dropped. She had hoped for the grant, of course, but hadn't dared to expect it. Are you serious? Rob, that's amazing! They hugged, both laughing with joy and disbelief. This grant meant they could move forward with their plans, providing resources and opportunities to young artists who might otherwise never have the chance. As the excitement settled, Mary felt a profound sense of responsibility. We've got a lot of work ahead of us, she said, her mind already racing with plans and possibilities. Rob nodded, his expression turning serious. We do. But if anyone can make this work, it's you, Mary. You've already changed so many lives, including your own. Just think of what you'll be able to do with this program. Mary smiled, touched by Rob's faith in her. She corrected gently. What we'll be able to do. I couldn't do any of this without you, Rob. As they began to discuss the next steps, Mary's phone buzzed with a text from Chris, asking if they could move up their first mentoring session. Mary quickly replied, suggesting they meet for coffee the next morning. That night, as Mary prepared for bed, she caught sight of herself in the mirror. Her brown hair was slightly mussed, and her face was tired but happy. She took a moment to really look at herself, to appreciate how far she'd come. From the scared, confused person she'd once been, to the confident, purpose-driven woman she was now. The transformation was remarkable. Yet, in many ways, she was still the same person who had stood on that beach, camera in hand, marveling at the beauty of the world. As she climbed into bed, Mary felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey she'd been on, for the people who had supported her, and for the opportunities that lay ahead. She fell asleep with a smile on her face, dreaming of the lives she would touch and the stories she would help tell. The next morning dawned bright and clear. Mary dressed in a flowing purple dress, feeling it suited her mood, regal and full of possibility. She headed to the coffee shop where she was meeting Chris, her mind already working on how best to guide this young photographer. Chris was already there when she arrived, nervously fiddling with his camera. Mary's heart went out to him, remembering her own early days of uncertainty and fear. "Good morning, Chris," she said warmly, sliding into the seat across from him. "I'm so glad we could meet today." Chris looked up, a mix of anxiety and excitement on his face. "Thank you for agreeing to meet so soon, Mary. I couldn't wait to start." Mary smiled encouragingly. "That's a good sign. Enthusiasm is half the battle in this business. Now, why don't you show me what you've been working on since we last met?" As Chris began to share his photos, Mary listened and observed carefully. She could see the talent there, raw and unrefined, but also the hesitation, the fear of fully expressing himself. "These are good, Chris," she said honestly. "But I think you're holding back. Tell me, what do you really want to say with your photography?" Chris was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing the edge of a photo. I want to show the world as I see it, as someone who doesn't fit neatly into any box, but I'm afraid of being too obvious, too controversial." Mary nodded, understanding. "Chris, the most powerful art comes from a place of truth. Your unique perspective is not a weakness. It's your strength. Embrace it." As they continued to talk, Mary shared stories from her own journey, both as a photographer and as a trans woman. She watched as Chris began to relax, to open up about his own struggles and aspirations. By the end of their meeting, Chris's eyes were shining with newfound determination.
"Thank you, Mary,"
he said earnestly.
"I feel like I can breathe for the first time in, well, forever."
Mary reached across the table, squeezing his hand gently. "This is just the beginning, Chris. Remember, every great journey starts with a single step." As they parted ways, Mary felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was why she had fought so hard to be herself, why she had pushed through the fear and uncertainty. Not just for her own sake, but for people like Chris, who needed to see that it was possible to be true to oneself and still succeed. She walked back to her studio, her mind already planning the next steps for the mentorship program. With the grant secured, there was so much to do. Finding a space, acquiring equipment, developing a curriculum. But as daunting as the task seemed, Mary felt ready for the challenge. As she entered the studio, she was greeted by the sight of Rob, surrounded by stacks of paperwork. He looked up as she entered, a wry smile on his face.
"Ready to dive in?"
he asked. Mary laughed, rolling up her sleeves. "More than ready," she replied, taking a seat next to him. As they worked, Mary felt a deep sense of contentment. This was where she was meant to be, doing work that mattered, surrounded by people who supported her. From that first moment on the beach, when she had seen herself clearly for the first time, to this moment of building something that could change lives, it had been quite a journey. And the best part was, she knew it was far from over. There were still so many stories to tell, so many lives to touch, so many moments to capture through her lens. Mary couldn't wait to see what the future held, both for herself and for all the young artists she would help along the way. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow through the studio windows, Mary paused in her work. She picked up her camera, framing a shot of Rob bent over his paperwork, the golden light illuminating his focused expression. Click. Another moment captured, another story told. She smiled to herself. Yes, this was exactly where she was meant to be.
Thanks for watching, my girlies! Be sure to check out Patreon for more!